So I think after sitting in the heat all day, everybody in this room is probably praying for more wind. In terms of this session, I'm going to particularly talk about four key things. One is GDG and our experience of offshore wind in a European context, and what lessons we can learn for Ireland, touching on supply chain opportunities before moving on to ports and harbours, and finally kind of next steps and where we go from here. So GDG, we set up the company in 2011, myself and a colleague. And I suppose as an engineering company, not exactly the ideal time to set up in the throes of the recession. So we were kind of forced to look outside of the country for opportunities. And in some ways, that was the best thing that we ever did. So we went to Europe, we went all over the world really. And that drew opportunities both onshore and offshore, but in particular offshore opportunities in the renewable space. Since then, we've grown from 2 people to 40 people, predominantly based in Dublin. We also have offices in Belfast, in Edinburgh, and a small office in London. And typically, we're operating at a high level in terms of skills and engineering capability for relatively complex and challenging projects. What we're trying to do is offer an innovation element that offers value for money, and value engineering in particular. So in terms of our experience in the offshore space, we've worked in oil and gas. It's a relatively small portion of the business, and that's been everywhere from the United States to the Persian Gulf, west of Africa. When we start looking at offshore wind, we move into kind of the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, South China Sea even. The one place we haven't worked is the Irish Sea, up until this year, that is. So we are seeing a change. And I was speaking to Jill earlier on, and we were talking about our definitions of a project and what is an offshore wind project. And it's a different thing for different people. So for a developer, an offshore wind project might be a very secure and tangible piece of infrastructure that they can develop out into a commercial asset. For us, an offshore project is when you have somebody willing to pay for services. And for us, we're now seeing offshore projects in the Irish Sea because you have people willing to commit investment and commit budgets, even if it is small budgets at this stage, to start progressing things down the development pipeline. And we see that as a huge step for things to come. So what have we seen in Europe in the last 5 years? We've seen a very much a changing landscape, and in particular around technology advancements. Turbine size has changed dramatically. When we started looking at offshore wind, it was 3 megawatt machines. Then very quickly it ramped up to 6 megawatt machines. And last year we worked with General Electric on a project where we're looking at a 12 megawatt turbine. If you think of what the impact of that is for the industry, it's huge. So where we were looking at 3 megawatt machines and moving to 12, you end up with a 2 or 3-fold decrease in the number of units that you're using. 2 or 3-fold decrease in the number of foundations that you're installing. We're also seeing maturity of the European supply chain. So initially, obviously, there has to be upskilling and upscaling for fabricators, for logistics companies, for craneage, across the entire supply chain. And then the supply chain gets comfortable with the industry, gets a good feeling for where it's going, commits the investment, and then that investment pays off in the projects down the line. We're also seeing engineering optimization from the last 5 years. As people have got more familiar with the projects, they've been able to optimize, they've been able to apply value engineering, and they've also been able to start looking at industrialization and standardization. So can we use, if we have multiple projects, can we standardize components? Can we look at industrial processes that ultimately reduce the risk profile of these projects? And when we combine all of that together, what does it leave us and what does it tell us? It tells us that offshore wind costs should come down. And that is the reality of what we've seen in Europe in recent years. So if we look at pre-2015, we had average prices that were greater than 100 euros per megawatt hour. We actually started a research project with University College Cork, I think in 2010. And it was a 4-year, well, it was probably 2012 by the time it actually got up and running. But the objective was to get the cost below 100 euros per megawatt hour. It was a 4-year project. And when 2016 came around and we were delivering our final report, the European Commission kind of were a little bit embarrassed to say that the industry was ahead of the research project. in that costs were already there. We were trying to promote how they would get below 100 euros per megawatt hour, and they were already there. Now, of course, we said, well, obviously they've been listening to everything we've been saying for the last 4 years. In 2016, the Borsay project hit 72 euros per megawatt hour. Kriegers Flak hit 60 euros per megawatt hour. So across Europe, we're seeing these competitive auction systems and competitive subsidy regimes that are falling and falling. And in March 2017, we had the announcement of the first subsidy-free wind farm. Now, while this tells a very good story, it's important not to get too carried away. So while we do have subsidy-free offshore wind, it's within particular constraints. It's within projects where grid connections are supplied. It's within projects where the state has paid for a certain amount of data upfront. And it's within projects that are located in a very secure and a very well-developed market. So touching on supply chain opportunities, I think it's important to consider the big picture for offshore wind. It's very easy when you get to offshore wind, people get a vision of a turbine and say, well, we're unlikely to develop a turbine manufacturing facility here in Ireland. It's hard to see Siemens relocating here. So what's the supply chain opportunity? And,
2 minutes.
Thanks. And I think we just need to be aware that the supply chain opportunity is so much bigger than the turbine. It's everything from the early stage engineering, through the installation phase, through the construction, through the operation and maintenance regime, which is maybe 30 years or more, and then the decommissioning. So there's a huge spread of supply chain opportunities that people can take advantage of. One particular one that I'm going to talk about is ports and harbours. And you've got two aspects to that. You've got your marshalling facility, which is a big installation port, and then you've got your O&M base. You'll see Belfast here on the left, and Rosslare, I think, on the right. Very recently, we've finished a project which I think will be publicly released, which is a report on gap analysis for the use of Irish ports and harbour infrastructure for renewable energy. And that kind of highlights a couple of things. It gave us an opportunity to engage with industry and assess what the scale of the supply chain will and desire to partake in renewable energies was. It also allowed us to identify areas which were in need of investment. And I'm not sure if anyone will recognize this particular picture, but it's the D1 facility in Belfast, which in the island of Ireland is the only custom purpose-built port or harbour facility. This required huge investment and huge commitment from the developers at the time. It was a Dong initiative. And the question is that port and harbour enough to service the entire country? And I don't have the answer. I mean, who knows? Because we don't know what the scale of the opportunity and the scale of the market is. So do we have similar facilities here if we do need them? And I think the reality is yes. This is just one random example. I picked Cork Dockyards, owned by Doyle Shipping Group, I think. But here's a facility that could be converted into a suitable marshalling facility or base for offshore wind development. Will it be? Unlikely until there's a clear route to market for the projects and a clear need for the investment. And one of the things we need to be aware of is these projects are at a scale where it takes significant time. If we want these developments to go ahead, you need to put investment into the ports and harbours now. If you're going to put the investment in now, you need to know what's happening down the line. So where do we go from here? We need clear policy support and route to market, particularly for offshore wind, but for all marine renewables. We need visibility on the project timelines, and that is key. So we need to know the scale of the opportunity, but when it's going to be realised. We need better certainty for strategic infrastructure. But on the positive side, we do have a supply chain that is very much willing and able. In terms of operations and maintenance ports, there is huge opportunities out there. We have port logistics companies here that have been servicing the shipping industry for decades that are well equipped to service the offshore wind sector. Secondary structure fabrication is possible here. O&M vessels, and then we also have transferable skills from other sectors. The very last bullet point, and I'll finish on this, I promise, is, and I was betwixt and between whether to put this up, partly because I'm personally conflicted. So do we need a dedicated supply chain management plan as part of the statutory process? I don't know. My personal view is that the supply chain is willing and able. It makes sense to use local content. Local content have knowledge that other people do not have. Local content also should be commercially a good option for projects. So I can see that the supply chain is willing and able on one hand, and it makes sense for developers on the other hand to engage with local supply chain. So I think it will happen naturally without the need to force it. What would a supply chain management plan actually do? It might accelerate that conversation. But I think it's an open question as to whether to include it in the consenting process. Thank you.